What's at stake for former President Trump? And we're going to check in with Paul Schiff Berman. He is a professor with the George Washington University School of Law. Thank you for being here with us this afternoon, Professor. You've said this is the most significant court case in American history. So let's start there.
Absolutely. We've never had a situation where a president is alleged to have taken part in a conspiracy to really overthrow the government, to overturn an election, to stay in power through authoritarian means. This has never happened. And so what happens in the next period of time with this trial, whether a guilty verdict is found or a not guilty verdict is found, is really cataclysmic for the country and supremely important for the rule of law. If we care about democracy, if we care about not going into authoritarian rule, then we have to care that this trial gets handled well.
What seems to be central to this case the government is making is that President Trump knew he was telling falsehoods. He was aware of it. He was not in the dark. That the people closest to him, who worked for him in the White House, in DOJ, were telling him this is not true. How are they going to prove that, though?
Well, so first of all, we have to understand that you can't just say, I was deluded, I'm, hearing voices from Mars, and therefore I thought I won the election, and expect that that's good enough to be a defense, right? It has to be a reasonable belief. And there seems to be allegations in this indictment that, first of all, Trump may have said on a number of occasions that he lost, but also that all of his closest advisors, all of the people he turned to for advice, were telling him, that's the Attorney General, that's his Vice President, that's his Chief of Staff, that's his General Counsel, that's the head of the Cybersecurity Agency. Everybody was telling him that there was no possibility that he won this election and that there was enough fraud to change the outcome. So whatever his belief might be, it wouldn't be a reasonable belief. At least that's the argument that Jack Smith will make. And in addition, even if he did have a reasonable belief that he won the election, the way to handle that is to challenge it in court. Right? So you don't go and then create a whole conspiracy to create a slate of false electors and call up secretaries of state of the different states and tell them to go find votes. If you think that you won the election and that there was election fraud, you go into court and you prove it. That's what Al Gore did, for example, in going into Florida to try to get a recount of the election in 2000. So that's how you handle it. So I think this idea that, well, he was deluded, he must have believed that he won the election and therefore there's no case, I think that's just not right.
The Trump legal team is also making this case about free speech, too, that he's allowed to say what he thinks he believes, to telegraph that. But the government is saying, yeah, you could say that. But what we're laying out in this case is not only we're not building on this on what you said, we're building this on what you are alleged to have done.
Yeah, you can go on television if you're the president and you can say whatever you want. Even if you knew it was false, you can lie on television, and that would be First Amendment protected speech. But what we're talking about here is not just saying, I won the election. It's saying, can you find votes, oh Secretary of State? It's saying to state legislators, get together an alternative group of electors. It's putting pressure on the Justice Department to say that there was election fraud and to start impounding voting machines. And all of that is not speech. That's conspiracy. So if I say to you, let's go rob a bank, that's speech, but it's not protected by the First Amendment. It's a crime.
So the government is laying out this indictment. They spend a fair amount of time, pages really, laying out this scheme and how these fake slates of electors would be created and how they would essentially forge documents in order to keep the president in office. I'm thinking about the co-conspirators that are not listed here, but are listed as co-conspirators throughout this entire document here. What happens to them as a result of what happens in court today?
So there are 6 co-conspirators that are not named but are referred to in this indictment. Based on the facts that are alleged about them in the indictment, we can pretty easily identify 5 of them. The 6th one is a little bit unclear. There's been speculation. But we're talking about Rudy Giuliani, and we're talking about Sidney Powell, and Ken Cheeseborough, and John Eastman, and Jeffrey Clark. And all of these people could be added to this indictment at any time. There's no rush.
So was this motivation to try to get them to talk?
I think there's probably 2 motivations on Jack Smith's part. One is to keep the focus on Trump and keep this a streamlined case. He's going to be trying to argue for a speedy trial, and so I think he wants to keep it simple. But also, this is a final warning, I think, to those 6 individuals that they need to come forward and testify and provide evidence against Trump or face consequences that they could be the next one indicted.
As you just mentioned, the president says he wants a speedy trial. He also wants a trial that's not here. He is requesting a change of venue, which I guess about a dozen other January 6th defendants have done, but not successfully. How likely is it that this trial will move from D.C. to West Virginia? And I should tell you, we just heard that the former president entered a plea of not guilty in court, which was anticipated.
Right, not surprising. Yeah, you know, the West Virginia gambit is just ludicrous on its face, right? So the federal venue statute makes clear that the venue where you bring a case is where the acts that are alleged to have created the criminal act that you're talking about also took place. So in this case, almost all the acts took place in Washington, D.C., and none of the acts took place in West Virginia. I mean, in theory, you could have an argument for Arizona or Wisconsin or Georgia or Pennsylvania, where at least there were some fake electors doing stuff. But there's no argument for West Virginia. And besides that, if the basis for a venue transfer was to try to come up with a jury pool that was 50-50 Republican and Democrat, you would have every criminal trial in the country would have to be held in a swing state. It's just unworkable, and I think that's not going anywhere. What really is going to happen is we're going to go forward in D.C., and Trump's lawyers, along with Jack Smith and the judge, will get to vet every single potential juror to see whether they are so biased, either in favor or against Trump, that they could not put that aside, put their political beliefs aside, and just listen to the evidence and decide based on the evidence. And that's what happens in every trial.
How hard is that going to be in a case like this, where, you know, everyone around the world was watching what happened on January 6th? And were gripped. And then we had the hearings. And so we saw this again and again and again. So how hard is it going to be able to, for them to put together an impartial jury?
Well, I've actually served on 2 juries, and so I have a tremendous belief in the jury system. I think jurors take their responsibility very seriously, and I think you will be able to find 12 people, not everyone, but you will be able to find 12 people who can put aside whatever their political beliefs are. So maybe they're a Republican, maybe they're a Democrat, but they can put that aside and say, is this person actually guilty based on the facts that are presented in this trial? And by the way, it's not just a question of, well, did January 6th happen or not? The question has to do with this entire conspiracy and all of these different acts and Trump's state of mind and so forth. And all of them have to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. So I think that there are jurors who will be able to say, for example, if you're a Democrat, I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I think he's a menace to society. I think he's was a bad president and would be a bad president. But nevertheless, I'm going to be an impartial juror. The judge is going to instruct me about the facts and the law, and I'm going to rule based on my understanding of that case. And I think that that's not far-fetched at all.
You've called this the most significant court case in American history, and yet most of us won't be able to actually see what's happening in the courtroom. There are some calls from people to televise this particular court case. Is that even possible?
I would love to see this trial televised, but I'm actually in favor of televising all trials unless there's something, you know, a national security reason or some kind of privacy reason not to do so. I think it's important for the American people to see our justice system at work. When I clerked at the US Supreme Court, I often invited friends to come sit and watch the proceedings. And what I found universally is that people who actually watched the Supreme Court at oral argument, even those justices they thought they were going to disagree with because of political position or judicial philosophy, they came away impressed at the seriousness of the dialogue, the discussion, the fact that it was really based on the law and not just politics and so forth. And so I actually think it would help both the Supreme Courts and the federal courts generally. I think it would help their legitimacy in the eyes of Americans if we could see what was going on.
You mentioned Supreme Court. I mean, Justice Roberts is essentially the head of the federal court system. He would have to weigh in, wouldn't he, if there were to be a move to televise these cases?
So there's, the Chief Justice Roberts is the Chief Justice of the United States, which means he is the administrative head of the federal court system. You know, that's partly ceremonial, it's partly sort of administrative. I guess it is possible that he could ask for these to be televised. I think it's not likely. And I think it's even less likely that Judge Chutkan would do it by herself, because that would potentially open up an avenue for an appeal. If Donald Trump were convicted, he could appeal and say, well, because of all of these cameras, it sort of changed the atmosphere in the courtroom, or it prejudiced the jurors against me, or whatever. And that, in and of itself, I think, would be a potential grounds for appeal. So I think she's not going to do it.
There's a lot more to get to, certainly. We're taking a look right now at what's happening around the courtroom. As we've heard, the president is in the courtroom, has entered a not guilty plea to these federal charges, and we are awaiting how this wraps up and what happens next. One of the questions I have is, will we find out today what this next court date will be, or is that something that will happen when this case is before Judge Chutkan?
Well, I think what's going to happen here is just before the magistrate judge. We will have a hearing and a scheduling meeting probably early next week with Judge Chutkan, and that's when we will get the first indication of at least what the initial trial date might be. Now, of course, Jack Smith is going to push to do this quickly. I think there's an argument that it is supremely important, particularly in this case, to have this trial occur before the election, because the American people need to know one way or another what this now candidate Trump did when he was president, and that's an important issue to be discussed and understood before you vote. So he's going to try to argue for that. Trump's lawyers obviously are going to argue for delay. They would like this to happen after the election in hopes that maybe Trump can win the election and then scuttle the entire federal indictment. So that will be a key question. And also, how will this fit in with the other cases that are going forward involving Trump? I think arguably this one, again, has the most significance for our democracy and for electoral politics. And so I think there's certainly an argument for this one to go first. But whether that will happen, we just don't know.